So, have you ever watched the news and just wondered if modern political unrest is really just spontaneous outrage, or if maybe there's a highly coordinated, invisible architecture running the whole show behind the scenes? Well, that is exactly what we're unpacking today. We're going to dive deep into the analytical framework of a pretty fascinating text called The Red Blueprint. This source presents a sweeping global history, and it argues that today's radical movements aren't organic, grassroots uprisings at all. Instead, the author claims they're actually direct, highly sophisticated, tech-driven descendants of 20th century insurgencies. Let's jump into this explainer and really unpack the architecture of this alleged subversion. To keep things totally objective as we analyze the source's claims, here is our roadmap for today. First, the historical origins. Second, modern evolution. Third, tactical parallels. Fourth, global entrenchment. And finally, strategic restoration. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the historical origins, tracing the timeline from 1789 to 1991. The author lays out a really clear chronological evolution of ideological warfare here. It starts with what the text calls the Jacobin blueprint during the French Revolution in 1789, which it identifies as the birth of the left. From there, the momentum shifts through Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1848, and then it materializes into the highly disciplined elite cadres of Lenin's vanguard in 1917. But according to the source, the real turning point is a massive cultural pivot in 1968, where the battlefield literally shifted from the factory floor to the university campus. Finally, this timeline wraps up with the 1991 collapse of the USSR. But here's the catch. The text claims this collapse wasn't actually the end. Instead, it acted as a massive evolutionary catalyst, essentially forcing these centralized networks to completely decentralize just to survive. A crucial pivot highlighted here is from Antonio Gramsci. He was a mid-20th century Marxist theorist who basically argued that a physical, violent revolution was just never going to work in the prosperous West. The middle class was simply too comfortable. So instead, he proposed the long march through the institutions. The idea being, before you can physically overthrow a government, you have to subvert its cultural infrastructure from the inside out. And think about what that means for us today. The text argues that this theory perfectly explains the current ideological climate in modern universities, media conglomerates, and even legal systems. Basically, if you capture the institutions that shape reality, you capture the entire nation without ever firing a single shot. Moving right along to Section 2, Modern Evolution, where we see a major shift from economics to identity. So, how does this abstract theory actually operate on the ground in the modern day? Well, the crucial point the text makes is that modern networks project massive influence without having a single central leader. They do this by using a highly functional three-tiered hierarchy. Think of it almost like a major corporate structure. Tier 1 is the institutional elite, professors, NGO directors, acting as the ideological engine that normalizes radical concepts from the top down. Right below them is Tier 2, the digital coordinators. They're the logistics hub, taking high-level theory and translating it into actionable plans. And finally, you've got Tier 3, the kinetic field operations. This is essentially the infantry on the street executing the disruption. The engine dictates to the hub, and the hub commands the infantry. To protect this incredibly intricate hierarchy, the source points out that these groups rely on what's called a need-to-know matrix. Now, that sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller, right? But functionally, it kind of is. It's a highly disciplined, completely siloed communication structure where operatives only interact with their immediate operational Ming using masked digital bridges. And why is this so ingenious? Well, if a single frontline cell is compromised or busted by law enforcement, they literally have zero actionable intelligence to give up. The broader network stays completely insulated and fully operational. Which brings us to Section 3, Tactical Parallels. Comparing then versus now. Now, what is really fascinating about this text is its comparative framework. It draws a direct, undeniable line between modern ground operations and their 20th century ancestors. According to this source, the old pyramid-style communist cell structure, like what the Bolsheviks used, was rigid, but it was also highly vulnerable. If you managed to catch the leader at the top, the whole thing fell apart. Today, that fragile pyramid has been entirely replaced by a fluid, leaderless franchise model. We're talking about autonomous affinity groups that launch actions under a shared brand. That means there is absolutely zero central command for counterintelligence to infiltrate. And when it comes to financing, the tactics have evolved just as dramatically. Picture a 20th century spy physically lugging heavy bags of smuggled Soviet gold across a border. The text asserts that this super cumbersome process has seamlessly shifted into the digital era.
Today, it's just a teenager tapping a button on their smartphone to send decentralized peer-to-peer micro-donations. We're seeing massive crowdsourced bail funds designed to extract operatives from jail almost instantly, ensuring they never sit in a cell long enough to actually cooperate with police.
The author also draws a pretty chilling parallel when it comes to intelligence tactics. The Soviet KGB famously relied on kompromat, basically blackmail and character assassination, to paralyze their political enemies through sheer fear. Today, the text argues, we face the modern equivalent: digital doxing and cyber intelligence campaigns aimed directly at police, judges, and private citizens. The mechanism has shifted from a physical manila folder of leaked dossiers to terrifying algorithmic pylons that can destroy a person's digital life in a matter of hours. But the psychological terror, that remains absolutely identical. Finally, let's look at communication. The text compares Cold War physical dead drops and those tiny microdots hidden on postage stamps to modern technology. Today's networks rely entirely on zero-knowledge encrypted messaging apps with auto-delete timers. Think Signal or Session, along with decentralized mesh networks. And the stakes here are incredibly high. The source really emphasizes that these aren't just convenient chat apps. They are military-grade evasive tools. They guarantee that absolutely no persistent trail is ever left behind, leaving state counterintelligence completely in the dark. All right, let's pivot to Section 4, Global Entrenchment, where we look at a specific case study, the South African transformation. The author applies this whole theory globally, using South Africa as a micro-narrative to show the dire structural consequences of institutional capture. It reads like a tragic three-step story of a nation's decline. Step 1, an alliance forms between the SACP and ANC, backed by massive Soviet sponsorship. Step 2 is the implementation of a post-1994 policy called cager deployment. This systematically replaced highly skilled technocrats with ideological loyalists. And Step 3 is the devastating result of that ideological hiring, a total collapse of the nation's energy and rail infrastructure. The author claims this collapse then fueled the rise of radical populism just to shift the blame away from sheer state incompetence. Drawing from that global analysis, the source asserts that successful systemic deconstruction leaves a compounding stain on Western nations, acting as the ultimate symptom of institutional capture. It actively creates a dual-track legal system based on selective enforcement. It systematically paralyzes police forces through operational demoralization. And, perhaps most significantly, it enforces widespread cultural demoralization that is centered entirely around historical guilt, rather than any kind of civic pride. This is how the text ties that micro-narrative back directly to a reality many Western citizens might recognize in their own backyards. Which leads us to a pretty pivotal question. If this structural breakdown is the reality that the text describes, how exactly does the author propose fighting back and reversing it? That brings us to our final part, Section 5, Strategic Restoration, Reversing the Current. The author argues for an aggressive, asymmetric counteroffensive. Instead of fighting on the enemy's terms, the proposed solutions start with high-level legal frameworks. We're talking about deploying RICO, organized crime laws, to systematically dismantle those funding pipelines, and strictly restoring judicial neutrality. Then it moves into financial pressure, stripping the tax-exempt statuses of subversive nonprofits and totally defunding ideological academic programs. But ultimately, the core of the strategy lands squarely on the power of the individual. It relies on everyday citizens to practice unyielding individual non-compliance with ideological mandates. Subversion is a parasite, and a parasite can never survive without a willing host. The author actually concludes on a surprisingly optimistic note here. By highlighting this relationship between a parasite and a host, the text argues that, despite all the highly sophisticated tech and the terrifying tactics, radical movements are fundamentally fragile. Their entire system is built on an illusion of absolute authority, an illusion that relies entirely on the silence, fear, and compliance of the majority. The moment people stop complying, the whole illusion shatters. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really striking thought to ponder. Is this structural shift a permanent stain on Western institutions, or does it carry the seeds of its own collapse? Is this ideological encirclement a permanent defeat, or does its total disconnection from objective reality guarantee its eventual downfall? That is the ultimate question the Red Blueprint leaves us to answer for ourselves.